in South Africa, or well, let's say for the past couple of years, there's been a lot of debate about Mandela's legacy and whether he's sold out, whether he pandered to white economic interests, during when the dawn of democracy came, that the land issue wasn't resolved, and people saying that because of that, that's why we're as unequal now and as divided now as we are, that, we were sold this ideal of the Rainbow Nation, which was never fully realized. What's your take on that?
Well, first of all, the Rainbow Nation hasn't been truly realized, but, changing from apartheid, which was not only just 50 years old itself, but went back to the British colonial rule. I mean, the elements of apartheid go right the way back under Britain. So changing that, overcoming a legacy of oppression of the black majority, of a deliberate policy of ensuring there was not proper education for black people in South Africa. It was a deliberate policy of apartheid. Massive poverty and all of that. To try and reverse that, even in a quarter of a century, it was always going to be difficult. So I think we need to acknowledge that. But for me, and I think the debate on Mandela's legacy and whether he was radical enough and whether economic transformation has happened is a really important debate. And people like me have got to understand that. My own view is this: if it hadn't been for the way Nelson Mandela had led the transformation, it would have been very, very damaging to South Africa. Look at the countries where there wasn't that orderly process, where it wasn't relatively a negotiated transformation. Look at Mozambique. Look at Angola. Countries devastated by civil war, absolutely devastated, and still suffering with that aftermath. I think there would have been a massive flight of currency and capital from South Africa if there hadn't been an accommodation with white capital and the white business community, so that they felt secure. I think that you'd have had an absolute flood of white refugees from the country, taking their skills and their wealth and their stake in the country with them. Would have been enormously damaging. All of that happened in Mozambique and Angola, and there are other examples. So I think the negotiated transition, and remember, Mandela was no soft touch. I show this in the book. He was tough. He stood up to the white government, to President de Klerk, and he demanded that he achieve the ANC's mission of justice and equality. Now, having said that, so I don't think the transition could have happened in any better way other than the way that it did. In fact, I think it could have been disastrous had it not been that negotiated transition. Now, having said that, and I hope that view is the majority view, not enough was done afterwards. And perhaps Nelson Mandela himself, in his first 5 years of rule, didn't do enough on this to actually bring about economic transformation. Yes, there's been black economic empowerment for a few at the top, and a black middle class, and many more opportunities for everybody in the country, regardless of the colour of its skin. I mean, South Africa today is completely unrecognisable for the better compared with the country I left as a teenager in 1966. Completely. It's as night and day. It's a marvellous country to visit for me compared with what it was. But not enough has been done to economically transform, and a lot more needs to be done. And the business community, which is not exclusively white anymore, but is still dominated by the white business owners and members, needs to transform as well and spread wealth. I don't think it's just about board members or black faces put at the top. It's about spreading wealth down and empowering workers and distributing ownership stakes. That's the agenda. I mean, land reforms also, I think, important. Much, is really, really difficult to do without discouraging foreign investment, which you need, because if you are investing in the country, you need to be sure that the land you're investing on is yours, that the factory that you have built is yours, otherwise you don't invest. It's as straightforward as that. So the policy has to be done in a way that takes account of that.
It's Nelson Mandela's centenary, and as part of this, you're involved in an exhibition that's taking place in London soon. Just tell us more about that.
Well, I'm very excited that the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg asked me to lead a committee, of a representative committee in London, to establish the first ever Nelson Mandela exhibition in Queen Elizabeth Hall in the South Bank Centre, a very prestigious venue. And I think it's going to be magnificent. I think it'll blow people's minds when they go there. And it'll be opened on the 17th of July and last for a month. And the launch will be a very big affair. So I hope what it'll do is remind people in Britain, where there was a strong anti-apartheid movement, but where especially the Conservative government, during those long 27 years that Nelson Mandela was in prison, basically only until, except for the end, they turned their back on Madiba and the struggle of the African majority for freedom and justice. And I think it's a chance for British people to be reminded of his contribution to history, to learn from it, and to recognize that Britain could have done a lot more, as could many other countries and governments like America, to free Nelson Mandela earlier and to free the country earlier. So I think there's a lot in this exhibition that will serve as a great memento and a reminder of his importance historically, but how his values are enduring and will continue throughout human history.
Just in conclusion then, the title of the book talks about the essential life. What is the essential life? What do you consider that to be?
Well, Nelson Mandela's life was essential because I can't imagine anybody else leading the ANC in a way that he did to achieve that negotiated transition in a way that was relatively peaceful and saw the country strengthen as a result of the transition, which was a radical transition. Remember, you know, it's one of the very few examples of a privileged minority, one of the most privileged in the world, giving up its power to the majority. I mean, that doesn't happen very often in history. I think his life was essential because he led that process. His life was essential also because the values that he stood for, social justice and equality and human rights and democracy and integrity, standing up for a free and independent media, that's really important. Even when some of his colleagues in the ANC were unhappy with him doing that, of just saying the truth must always be out. You know, the world needs to understand that. I mean, we have a world today which could do with a dose of Nelson Mandela's leadership big time. You've got President Trump, you've got President Putin, you've got Erdogan in Turkey, you know, all these authoritarian figures. They appeal to people's base instincts. Nelson Mandela always appealed to people's higher instincts in the way that he led. And that should serve as a lesson for the leaders of the world today as well. And we should remember his essential life for that reason too.
Lord Hain, thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure and a privilege talking to you, and especially about him.